Welcome to the first video of section number 3. In this video, we will discuss how to style Electron applications and how to tweak the Electron web view to make it more desktop friendly and avoid various common pitfalls that developers make when creating their first desktop applications. If you're coming from the front-end world, then you are probably used to rely on CSS frameworks like Bootstrap or Foundation, which provide components, grids, and other utilities out of the box. Most of these frameworks are concerned with unifying styles across different web browsers. In Electron applications, we're only targeting a single web browser, a specific version of Chromium, so this is not something we require. Still, these frameworks provide well-built UI components and layout systems that you can use to quickly create a pretty application. So you might be wondering if it would be worth using one of them anyway. So you basically have two choices: to use a CSS framework or to build everything yourself. We will discuss both approaches in more detail. Let's consider the first option, which is to use an existing CSS framework. Sadly, there are not a lot of mature CSS frameworks that target desktop web applications. The best one out there is PhotonKit, that you can find at photonkit.com, which targets Electron specifically. However, it implements a macOS look and feel, which looks really weird if you plan to release your application to other operating systems. So we'll have to look at frameworks that target web applications. Here are the main characteristics of CSS frameworks that we should consider for building Electron applications. First, the framework should target modern web browsers, so we don't bring hundreds of CSS rules that are only meant to work around older web browsers' limitations. Then, we should make sure that the framework we choose has a grid system based on Flexbox. In case you haven't heard of it, Flexbox is a modern CSS layout model that makes building complex application layouts a breeze. Finally, make sure that the framework you choose targets web applications and not web pages, since we don't want our desktop application to look like a document. I personally recommend going for Bootstrap 4, UIKit, Semantic UI, or Foundation for apps. Keep in mind that no matter which framework you choose, you will have to do some tweaking on top to really bring a desktop look and feel to the application. Now, let's consider the other approach, to build everything from scratch. This obviously requires a bit more upfront work, and it won't give you a sane look and feel from day one, but allows you to have full control over every single CSS rule that gets into the codebase. Since we only target a single browser, Chromium, this means that we can get rid of a lot of unnecessary rules. If you're building an application where rendering speed is important, like a text editor for example, then this is probably the way to go. Even if you decide to build things yourself, consider bringing in CSS modules to simplify layout handling. I personally recommend Flexbox Grid, which is a tiny CSS library that provides a Flexbox-based CSS grid. Ultimately, whether to use an existing CSS framework or build it all yourself depends on your project. If you're building a prototype and you want to get up and running as fast as possible, then go for a CSS framework. If you want to dedicate time to polish the visuals of your application and squeeze the last drop of rendering performance, then build it from scratch. There are various pitfalls that are so common in desktop web applications that warrant some specific attention. The first one is bottom outlines. Some old CSS frameworks add an outline to buttons after they have been clicked. Let me show you what I mean. I have a small Electron application here that makes use of Bootstrap 3 and displays some buttons on the screen. If I click one of the buttons, you will see an ugly blue outline that doesn't go away until I click somewhere else. We can easily fix this by setting the outline none rule when the button is focused. We pass exclamation sign important here to make sure this rule always has top precedence. If we try clicking the buttons again, we can see that the outline is gone. There is another subtle detail that can detriment a web desktop application experience, which is arbitrary user selection. User selection is fine on certain parts of the application, like the main text content. However, web views allow you to freely select anything, including buttons and navigations, which looks terrible. Let's look at an example. This application contains a navigation bar, a sidebar, and some text content. Check out what happens if I try to select everything on the application window. I don't know about you, but I never saw something like this on a native desktop application. We can fix this by adding the following CSS rule to the elements where we don't want the user to be able to perform text selection. In this case, let's add it to the navigation bar and to the sidebar. Now, if we try selecting things again, we will only be able to select the main content, as expected. Finally, let's consider what happens if we try to zoom in on our application, using the example from the previous slide. And well, this is definitely not good desktop user experience. The standard web application approach of adding a meta tag to customize the viewport won't work on Electron. But luckily, Electron provides an API available on the renderer process to customize the zoom limits. Let's require Electron on our window and call electron.webFrame.setZoomLevelLimits and pass 1 and 1. The first argument of this function determines the minimum zoom factor, and the second argument determines the maximum zoom factor. By setting both to 1, we completely prevent the user from zooming in or out. In this lesson, we discussed whether you should use an existing CSS framework or not, considering each approach in detail. Then, we covered 3 common pitfalls when creating the front end of a desktop web application. The first one is bottom outlines, which we can tweak by using the outline CSS property. The second pitfall is arbitrary user selection, which we can fix by setting the user select property. And finally, application zoom, which we can control by using the Electron-specific function of the web frame property called setZoomLevelLimits.